Hello everyone, Tom Simmons coming to you today from Buckland, Massachusetts with the Lamson and Goodnow factory in the background. And the reason that I chose this location today was because we're going to look in this lesson at how sports, and baseball in particular, was a direct reflection of the times when it became our national pastime. After the Civil War, in the mid-1800s, the United States went through an industrial revolution, and it totally changed the way that Americans worked and went to work and what life was like on a daily basis. Baseball is a reflection of that change that took place in society, and it's one of the reasons why baseball took off and became our national sport at exactly the same time. And so we're looking at the period from the 1870s and 80s up to the early 1920s and 30s, that whole period of time when the economic landscape of the United States changed. Now think about it. Before the Industrial Revolution, most people had a subsistence life, meaning they grew their own food, they had their own farm animals, they worked from before the sun came up until after the sun came down, just for survival, trying to carve out a life for themselves to make sure they had food and firewood and clothing. With the Industrial Revolution, everything changed. With the Industrial Revolution, you didn't work from before sun up until after sundown round the clock. You went to work. You had set hours in a factory, and they may have been long hours, but you had set hours. It also meant that instead of spending a few years raising sheep and then shearing their wool and then cleaning it and carding it and making it into yarn and knitting that into clothing so that you might have a little extra clothing after a couple of years, you could actually buy it, because textiles were being made on enormous machines, on enormous looms, in mechanized factories. That was a big change to how Americans lived their life. And it meant that you had set hours. It meant you went to a specific job. It meant that you had money to buy things with, rather than having to just make all of those goods yourself. In many ways, baseball reflects some of those changes that took place in society. So, let's look at some of those in a little more detail. For instance, Americans no longer lived in the country, but moved to the city. We became an urban population, because factories were located in urban places. And if they weren't, the places where they were located soon became urban. Because instead of people living each on their own farm, they began to live near the factory so they could go to work. That, having a critical mass of urban population, made it possible to go to a sports game. If everyone is living in far-flung areas, in mountains and farms, it's hard to get to a game. But once people started moving to cities, it became possible to actually walk or take public transit, if it existed, to a game. Think of Fenway Park, right in the middle of the city. People could walk in the city to the game. It also meant they had an increase in real wages. Instead of one farmer bartering, I'll give you 2 sheep if you'll give me X number of chicken, and we'll swap meat. Now we had money, and we could actually go and use that money to buy a ticket to something. And one of the things you could buy a ticket to would be a professional game. Since you had set hours, it meant that when you were done with work, you could actually go and enjoy something. So you now had dollars to purchase leisure activities. But even more important, you actually had the time that you could use to spend those dollars purchasing that leisure activity. So all of these factors began to come together just as baseball is beginning to get organized as a sport in the United States. If you think of it, the structure of baseball also mimics the structure of the new workplace. Instead of being a farmer, where you did everything yourself start to finish, factories were places where you had a hierarchy of management. You had maybe the owner, and then you had a manager of the entire plant, and then maybe you had specific floor managers of different departments in the plant, and then you had your workers. Baseball is organized exactly the same way, with your owner and your manager and your coaches and your players. And so it was something that was very familiar and very consistent with what people were experiencing in their daily life. This is how life is organized. This is how the sport is organized. For those people working in factories, very few people worked in factories where they did everything. Instead, each person would work a particular machine or a particular process on an assembly line. You wouldn't do everything. Well, look at how baseball is organized. Your pitcher is not your second baseman. Your catcher is not your shortstop. You have a specialization of labor. The Industrial Revolution brought about specialization of labor, meaning that people went, again, from trying to do everything for their homestead to doing a specific job within a team. That's exactly what happens in baseball, where you have a specific role and you do a specific job within a team, and you operate under a hierarchy of structure. So in so many ways, baseball actually reflected the very existence that people were moving into. It was something they were familiar with, something that made sense, something that reflected their work life. And they had the time and the money to be able to finally spend it enjoying themselves. In other ways, baseball also answered some of the anxieties that people were feeling as a result of these incredible changes taking place in the society. First of all, we had been a people used to working and being outdoors all the time. Now we were stuck inside of a building. Baseball, or going to a stadium, allowed people to get out of that building. It allowed them to get out of the four walls and the factory and the noise and maybe the closed atmosphere, and get out and breathe the fresh air that they were no longer getting on a daily basis as they were working in that factory. We also were undergoing a time of incredible immigration, one of the largest periods of immigration in the United States. People from all over Southern and Eastern Europe coming to the United States in the late 1800s, Central Europe and Northern Europe, and then later in the 1920s, Eastern and Southern Europe. A lot of different people, a lot of different languages, a lot of different backgrounds. How do you form one society out of this diverse group of people who are all living very close to one another, often in tenements, in very urban atmospheres? Well, one of the ways that we did that was to bring everyone together into a national sport. It didn't matter if you were Italian or Polish or Russian or Irish or German or native-born American. Everyone went to the game and had the same experience in the same place. So these anxieties that began to be created by everyone living close together in an urban setting, working indoors instead of outdoors, a whole new change to the diversity of the country. One of those outlets for all of those anxieties was, again, baseball. So it was a very interesting situation whereby in some ways the sport reflected what they were familiar with and what they did on a daily basis and what they knew in terms of their workplace. And on the other hand, it was an outlet for the anxieties that new way of living, that new lifestyle was actually producing in the United States. As we move forward, we see that there was always a need to keep up with a desire for change. Americans like new things, new fads. Doesn't matter whether it's poodle skirts and hula hoops, or Cabbage Patch Dolls and Tickle Me Elmo and Tamagotchis, or whatever the newest fad and the newest thing is. People like something new, a new product differentiation. By the 1940s, 50s, 60s, even within the context of baseball, people were looking for something new. And one of the pioneers in baseball was Bill Veeck. And Bill Veeck owned the St. Louis Browns, the Cleveland Indians, the Chicago White Sox. He owned a number of teams from the 40s through the 1960s. And he saw the need to change, for baseball to change with the society. He brought things to baseball games: belly dancers, circus acts, Shakespeare nights. He had music nights where they gave out free kazoos at the stadium. Exploding scoreboards, which we now take for granted, that was initiated by him. Players' names on their jerseys. We take that for granted now. We expect every sport to see a player's name on the back of their jersey. That's something that Bill Veeck actually invented as a new thing, so that fans could actually watch the players and know who is who as they were, running the bases or taking the field. He signed Larry Doby, who was the first black player in the American League in baseball. He did new and different things that caught the public imagination. And I raise Bill Veeck, I raise him because he saw that sports, that any product, including professional sports, needs to change with the time, needs to capture the imagination of a new generation, needs to be relevant to a new generation. So that brings us to where we are today. We're living in a very different time than we lived in a generation ago. Think of the internet, your access to the entire world. Economics has gone global. You can buy almost anything from any country in the world on the internet and have it delivered to your house in a few days. We live on computers and laptops and iPhones and iPads. We move fast. We do a lot of things at once. We have instant access to information. When I was growing up and I wanted to find something out and I didn't have a book at home, I'd have to wait until I went to the library, and then I'd go look it up. When you want to find a fact out, you Google it. Everything has changed. It moves fast. So now, in this fast-moving society where we're used to instant answers, instant gratifications, things moving non-stop, how does baseball fit into that? It's a long season. 162 games. How long is an individual game? As long as it takes. Because it's not like it's timed. It's not like there's a certain number of minutes in a period or a half. A baseball game can go on forever. It can go on for 21 or 22 innings. And a lot of people have war stories about the games that took all night long and they were there to the very end. But the question becomes, that slow movement of the game, that long season, the never-ending game, the fact that you might wait several minutes between one pitch and the next, is that going to meet the needs of a society that is used to push-button, instantaneous answers? And ironically, the last time I went to a baseball game, I looked around, and a lot of the people in the stands with me had their phones out. And in between pitches and in between actions, we're texting people and talking to people. because they were moving faster than the game was. And that becomes a question as to whether or not baseball can continue to capture the imagination of a culture that is very instantaneous. There's other issues, of course, that will also affect Americans' desire to embrace baseball, to go to baseball games, and their enjoyment of that game. We're changing in many ways as a culture, in how we spend our time and money, in what we think is a cost-effective price for a ticket, in what the middle class is able to afford in terms of going to a game. The demographics of our country are changing significantly and rapidly, as rapidly as they were in the 1920s. So does that suggest that that rapid demographic change will suggest a different sport rising to the top? That's the question for you to examine and look at in this lesson, as you look at how culture and sports are not separate, but really reflect each other, and how the future of sports is going to be dependent, and the future of that sports market will be dependent on what the future United States is going to look like.